Paranormal Romance has risen from the dead, and so have I. So I haven't uploaded in a long time, but now felt like a perfect time to talk about the reemergence of a recently deceased genre, the paranormal romance, especially with this announcement that Midnight Sun is going to be coming out this August. I thought now would be as good a time as any to talk about the hot vampires that came before. First of all, there's obviously more to the paranormal genre than just vampires. Paranormal as a genre can encompass any phenomena that cannot be understood or proven by science. So vampires, aliens, werewolves, Bigfoot, and much more than that are all included in this genre. However, in my research for this video, vampires tend to be at the forefront of these big waves of popularity we see for the genre, and so a lot of my focus is going to be on those particular works. And this is going to be a really long one, so let's just dive right into it. I missed a chance to say sink your teeth in. Okay. Paranormal romance finds its roots, as you might imagine, in the Gothic period, as people start expressing more interest in things like ghost stories and the unexplained. Gothic novels really start showing up in the latter half of the 18th century after the publication of a book called The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole in 1764. In this story, a lord's son dies just before his wedding day in what is assumed to be the first fallen domino of a curse that will wipe out the entire family line. In the story that follows, nothing goes right for pretty much anybody. So there's your Gothic novel, alright. Soon, though, Gothic novels broaden in their scope, and then a lot of women actually start taking on the role of both consumer and creator, adding a romantic spin on these ghostly stories. One such lady is Anne Radcliffe, who would become one of the most famous Gothic romance writers of her time. Between 1789 and 1826, she writes 6 novels, the 4th of which is her most famous, titled The Mysteries of Udolpho, which is actually referenced in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. The formula is simple. A vulnerable, down-on-her-luck damsel meets a mysterious, suspicious hero who is probably hiding more than just a bad drinking habit. At this point, vampires and the like weren't really the lead romantic interests in these stories. Rather, they were mostly reserved for the monsters, the villains, or the unseen things that go bump in the night within these castles that served as these novel settings. For example, Emily, the protagonist of The Mysteries of Udolpho, has to escape the scary crumbling castle and the evil guy living inside in order to find her way back to her true love. Just a regular dude. Vampires would get their chance to sparkle in the sun soon enough, though. Before monsters like the vampire could be considered viable romantic interests, though, they needed to stop being so dang creepy. So, vampires, when they get hot. Ginny, you wanna come up? Come on. Vampires as we know them today didn't even really exist until after the publication of Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. Vampires as a creature already existed, obviously, and they stemmed from multiple different forms of folklore and myths from all over the world. So it wasn't until Dracula that one specific version of these bloodsuckers became popularized on such a wide scale. Because of this, Dracula is where most modern myths of vampires come from. Most know Dracula as an immortal blood drinker with super strength and the ability to turn into a bat. But this version of a vampire is also where we get things like casting no shadow, having no reflection in the mirror, being able to do some vampire voodoo to hypnotize their victims, and needing to be invited into a house before the vampire can enter.
What are you doing here? Waiting for Elena to invite me in.
Oh, yeah, you...
No. He can't, he can't stay.
It's fine. Just come on in.
Dracula, let's be clear, was not always hot, at least not to the extent that we see in a lot of vampire stories today. In some depictions, he's just as scary and hideous as the vampires who came before him, but in other depictions, he's a smooth, attractive, albeit suspicious guy who can lure in victims with his charm just as well as he does with his vampire mind powers. That mysterious allure is what leads a lot of paranormal romance writers to think, you know, maybe the girl should end up with the monster. Fast forward to 1973, and vampires are definitely hot now. Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice steps directly into the world of supernatural creatures, following a group of vampires as they move between Louisiana and Europe. Louis, the interviewee, recounts his early life in Louisiana, as well as his subsequent vampirization at the hands of a vampire named Lestat, who later becomes his lover. Throw in some vampire children, murder attempts, actual murders, and you've got one of the most popular pieces of paranormal fiction to date. In the following years, these modern Gothic novelists delve even deeper into the paranormal, including other creatures like werewolves, witches, ghosts, and more into the mix. They're all hot now. The next big win for vampires specifically comes in the form of television show Buffy the Vampire Slayer in 1997, which brings paranormal stories and romances even deeper into the mainstream. This marks yet another shift because previously vampires were generally reserved for historical stories. Even in Interview with the Vampire, though Louis is giving his interview in the modern day, most of the story is told from the past back in the 18th and 19th centuries. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, however, fully introduces vampires and their daily lives into the modern world, leather jackets and all. Buffy also stands as an example of an increasing trend to give these modern gothic heroines a little bit more agency and some less damsel-like qualities. A few years later, at the turn of the 21st century, a woman named Stephenie Meyer has a dream that would later turn into the Twilight saga. Meyer took elements of Stoker's vampires, but she leaned hard into the sexy, mysterious side of vampirism, getting rid of the gross bits like bats and stakes to the heart. But let's be honest, if you're watching this video, you already know all about Twilight's vampires. They're pale, they sparkle, they've got a lot of wacky powers. Moving on. After the success of Twilight, both as a novel series and a film franchise, both publishers and Hollywood alike rushed to replicate its success with their own paranormal romances. Vampires certainly get the lion's share of the love, with novel series like the House of Night series by PC Cast and Kristen Cast, television shows like The Vampire Diaries, adapted from a novel series in the early 90s by L.J. Smith, HBO's True Blood, based on the Southern Vampire Mysteries by Charlene Harris, and some later films like The Vampire Academy, based on the novels by Rochelle Mead. Werewolves also get some recognition with novels like Shiver by Maggie Stiefvater, and television shows like MTV's Teen Wolf peppering the vampire dense market. There are a ton more, so this list is hardly exhaustive, but suffice it to say that the early 2000s to the mid-2010s were a pretty great time to be a vampire in fiction, especially within the YA demographic. Once the golden age of paranormal romance has passed, however, people get kind of bored of the same old thing. It's not as though interest just disappeared overnight, but rather, the TV shows and novels that people were so obsessed over drew to their natural close, and people just weren't really into the idea of something new. The last Twilight book is published in 2008, and by 2012, the final Twilight film installment is done too. The Vampire Diaries holds out the longest, its final episode airing in 2017, but by this time, interest in new paranormal romance has all but disappeared. The paranormal romance genre is dead. This is when the Twilight hate train is at its strongest, tainting public opinion of most supernatural and paranormal romances just by association. The causes, purposes, and pitfalls of this widespread hate is a whole nother issue that is deserving of its own video. I recommend this one by Lindsay Ellis. Once people get bored of hating Twilight just about as much as they'd gotten bored of loving it, publishers start putting out tentative feelers to test public interest in potential new paranormal romance stories. The genre hadn't been hit so hard in the adult market, but the idea of a new paranormal YA romance was a much riskier move. Thankfully, due to the development of a new adult demographic in recent years, some new stories were able to come out within that demographic that kind of bridged the gap between the YA and adult paranormal markets. New adult paranormal romance From Blood and Ash by Jennifer Armentrout comes to mind as a very recent example. Thanks to these recent inclusions into the paranormal romance market, public opinion has steadily gone from mobs with pitchforks and fire rushing down the streets to chase down anybody who dares make a vampire book, to a hesitant, sure, I guess. That is, until Twilight author Stephenie Meyer leaves a mysterious countdown on her website, and repressed Twilight fans everywhere collectively lose their marbles. And finally, here we are. After canceling the project due to a leak back in 2008, Stephenie Meyer is finally publishing Midnight Sun, following Edward through the events of the first Twilight book on August 4th of 2020. The resurgence of paranormal romance, especially within the YA and NA markets, seem to have been going at a tentative crawl so far, but with the release of Midnight Sun coming up, I do think we might be on the cusp of a new boom of paranormal and specifically vampire romances, whether that thought strikes you with joy or terror. So there you have it, a not so brief yet not nearly exhaustive history of paranormal romance and specifically vampires' space within it. I learned so much stuff just through my research for this video, so I hope that you've gained at least a nugget or two of knowledge that you can now lord over your friends' heads when you very casually talk about vampires, as everyone does, right? And if you already knew everything I talked about in this video, then, well, at least any time you wasted watching it is nothing compared to the amount of time I wasted putting it together. Anyway, that's it for me this week. I said at the beginning of the video that I have not posted in a long time, and that is true. As you guys will know if you've been following my channel, I took a bit of a break at the beginning of the year because I wanted to think about where I wanted my channel to go and what kind of content I wanted to make on this channel going forward into the new year. And then, as it turned out, the new year sucks. I'm sorry that it took so long, but I am back, and I am planning on making a video at least every other week. That is my tentative schedule going forward, so make sure that you are subscribed and that you have notifications turned on and that you're following me on Twitter and things that YouTubers say. I'm gonna, all of those things. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and stay inside. Good Lord. and I will see you in the next one.